These are the materials that I will be using in today's lesson. You can find a list in the video description. These are the paint colors I will be using today. You don't need these exact colors, just get somewhere close. If you need something to reference, I do have a list of these colors in the video description as well. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print from home. Once you've printed it at the scale you plan on painting it, flip the line drawing over to the back, take pencil, and apply graphite all over the back of the paper. Once you've done that behind the entire subject, position it in place so that it is touching your watercolor paper, and then tape it in position so it does not shift. Take a ballpoint pen and then trace the line drawing, and because of the pressure of your pen, it will actually force the graphite on to your watercolor paper. You want a medium gray, nothing too dark and nothing too light. Just make sure you get your lines. The lines that are in dashed, those are optional just to indicate where some shadows are. If you feel they would be helpful, you can also transfer those. But once you have all your lines transferred, just remove your line drawing and set it aside. Now, before you begin painting, I want you to consider that watercolor paints are transparent. So if you have really dark pencil lines from your transfer or smudges on your watercolor paper from just rusting the weight of your hand during the transfer, then I recommend getting a kneaded eraser to lift and lighten some of those lines and scuffs. Your kneaded eraser can be used like a traditional eraser by rubbing it back and forth to remove anything that you don't want to show up at all. But you can also simply apply pressure over top of any dark pencil lines to soften them. Most of these lines are going to be up against dark values in the background and flower, so I'm honestly not too worried about it. And then just set your kneaded eraser aside. Now the background, I want it to look blurred, like a blurred field of flowers. In order for me to wet the background and paint it freely, without the stress of accidentally hitting my flower, I'm going to protect my flower with the use of masking fluid. There's many different brands. This is simply one of all. Now, masking fluid can be very tough on your brushes. So I recommend taking Dawn dish soap and putting a little bit of this in with your water in a paint cup. And I'm just going to thoroughly mix the soap in this water to make sure it also coats the bristles of my brush really well. This is going to provide a layer of protection so the masking fluid will rinse out of my brush and not cause damage. Once your brush is coated in the soap, you can then dip your brush in the masking fluid and take your time and go around just on the inside of your pencil lines around the outer edge. We want about 1/4 of an inch of thickness just to kind of give us some wiggle room when we paint the background. So what's going to happen is this masking fluid is going to keep the paint out of this area so I can add water and color and not hit my flower. It dries very quickly and it has kind of this plastic rubber finish. I'm going to extend my stem all the way off the edge of my watercolor block. Now I've gone a fairly good distance with this masking fluid, And I know from experience that if I leave it on the brush too long without rinsing, it could potentially ruin my tools. So I'm going to use that soapy water to clean my brush again and to add a layer of protection before continuing. I really try to do my best to trace the outer edge and as few paint strokes as possible, just to ensure I have a nice, smooth contour to the outside shape of my subject. If I apply my masking fluid using a lot of different brush strokes and angles, I run the risk of having a very wobbly outside edge. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I have gone around the entire outside edge of my flower, and I'm now going to let that masking fluid completely dry. Make sure you really rinse your brush well so no masking fluid remains on your tools. While that masking fluid is drying, I'm going to take a moment to mix some of the paint colors I plan to have in the background. If you already are confident in mixing your paint colors, you can go ahead and skip to the next section of this video using the hyperlinked chapters below in the video description. Now, I would like a very saturated, vibrant background. So I'm going to be pretty heavy-handed with the amount of paint I add to my palette. I don't want these colors to be watered down. Keep in mind, watercolors will always dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So if you want a darker color, you could use less water or simply just be heavy-handed with the amount of pigment you add to the water on your palette. I've just added sap green to 2 wells. I'm now going to make one of them a little bit darker by adding some ultramarine blue, which is kind of like a navy blue. In addition to these greens, I would also like to have some cerulean blue, which is kind of like a nice baby blue or sky blue color. And again, I'm being very heavy-handed with all the pigments. I can add a little bit of that ultramarine blue to my cerulean just to make it a touch deeper in value. I'm now going to make a mixture of alizarin crimson, which is kind of a cool red. And if I want this color to really look like a red instead of a pink, I need to be very heavy-handed with the amount of pigment I add to my water. As long as your paint isn't thick and goopy, then you're going to be okay. The last color I'm going to use is a purple lake. This is a very warm purple, so it kind of leans towards the pink side. And in just that short time of mixing my paint colors, my masking fluid has now dried. So I can now take a large brush. This just happens to be a mop brush. I find it's really good at bringing a large amount of water over to my paper with less effort. So I'm applying clean water all over the background. I'm not afraid of the water hitting or being on top of that masking fluid. I'm just trying not to go past the masking fluid into the center of my flower. The first layer of water you add to your watercolor block is most likely going to saturate and be absorbed by the paper very quickly. So it's going to want to dry really fast. So in order to ensure I have the working time I need, I'm being very heavy-handed with how much water I apply in this initial coat. Once I have everything in the background saturated, then I can worry about absorbing any excess puddles just to give myself more control and predictable results. So everything's covered in water now except for the flower. I'm taking a moment to just kind of spread out any puddles I have to evenly distribute. If after spreading everything out, I still feel that I have puddling in certain areas or low points of my paper, I can use my brush to absorb them. So I'm just going to dry my mop brush off on a sponge or paper towel. And then in any areas where I have low points in my paper or puddles on the outer edges of my block, I use my dry brush to soak them up. I don't want to dry the paper. I just want to remove the puddling. Everything should still be very glossy. Once you have the right amount of water on your paper, get a large round brush and begin adding color. Try not to stress too much about getting shapes perfect. Focus more on values and interesting shapes. So on the right side, I want to have a lighter value. So it kind of creates a glow or light source for me. But notice how I am not smoothing out all the edges and doing big, broad up and down strokes. I'm focusing on interesting shapes. And after I have my sap green in, I'm going to go to my darker green, which has the added ultramarine blue. Now this paper is going to want to dry rather quickly, so I can't delay too much and worry about small little perfections. I want you to just kind of have fun with this and enjoy the way it feels to apply paint to wet paper while watching all the colors blend. I'm rinsing the green out of my brush and I'm grabbing some of that cerulean blue that I added the ultramarine to. If you feel like your paper is already beginning to lose that glossy sheen from the water, then you may need to use an ultra-fine water mister just to mist the surface of your paper to extend your working time. This is a water mister that I find helpful. And I'm not being heavy-handed with it, just really lightly in the areas where I feel like the sheen is already beginning to go away. Now, before I go too far, I'm just going to take a damp brush with little circular motions, and I'm just going to do some blending with some of my colors on the paper itself. If you have a lot of puddling of paint right now, that means you've been overloading your brush before you go to your paper. A lot of times when I dip my brush into my paint, before I go to my paper, I drag my brush across the rim of my palette once, so it is semi-loaded. If you fully submerge your brush into your paint, and then you bring it over to your paper without wiping it off once, then you are fully loading your brush, which will create a lot of puddling on your paper surface, making it difficult to control where your colors go. So I did a little blending on the right-hand side. I'm going to now grab some of that Purple Lake. And I want it to kind of give the illusion of blurred flowers in the background. So I'm not going to be super particular about, shape and details. I just want to kind of get some color in to fill this background here. After I have some Purple Lake down, I'm going to grab some of that alizarin crimson. Notice how I'm just creating large, wide ovals that might mimic or hint at the shape of a tulip in the background. And notice how I'm being fairly quick at this. Again, I'm not trying to pursue perfection here. I just want to give the illusion of a blurred background. Now I have most of the background color or covered in color. Now, before things dry, I can continue to focus on some of the blending to fill any little remaining whites, as well as just kind of modifying some of my shapes a little bit. And if your colors kind of run together, creating some wild texture that you didn't necessarily intend, I want you to embrace it because that's kind of the fun part of watercolors, and that's going to actually add some interest to your painting. If you smooth all that out, you're actually going to lose that interesting texture that only watercolors can provide. Now, before I walk away and let this background dry, I'm going to absorb any of the large puddles of paint that might be hanging out around the outer edge of my flower or the outer edge of my watercolor block. And this is just going to ensure that I have a little bit more of a predictable texture when it dries. Letting puddles sit on your paper will actually create blooms that you did not intend. And they can sometimes turn out wonderful, but sometimes they can catch you off guard. So for just a more predictable result, I'm going around with a dry brush and very gently tapping my dry brush where I see puddles. And then I'm going to let this background dry. Now that everything is completely dry, make sure you have clean fingers. And with just the pressure of your fingers, you can rub the masking fluid off your watercolor paper. If you're having a hard time removing any masking fluid, you can also use what is called a rubber cement pickup to help out. It's kind of this stiff block of rubber that really kind of helps get the masking fluid off the paper that is being stubborn. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once you have all the masking fluid lifted, just take your entire watercolor block or paper to a nearby trash can. Once your masking fluid is cleaned up, you can then take a pencil and trace any lines that may have disappeared in the removal of the masking fluid. Once you have your lines back in place, you can use your kneaded eraser again if you feel like any of them might show up in the finished painting. Now we're going to paint this flower simply one petal at a time. So using a number 8 round brush, I'm going to begin with this petal on the left-hand side. And I'm going to do a wet into wet painting. So I'm going to begin by applying clean water just to the inside shape of this left petal. I'm avoiding the background, and I'm doing my best not to bring the water into other petals that are nearby. And just like in the background, this first initial layer of water is going to want to dry very quickly. So I have to be pretty heavy-handed in the beginning just to ensure things stay damp. You want to have a glossy appearance to the petal, but you want the water to be thin enough so that you can see the texture of your watercolor paper. If it is too thin, you're not going to have enough working time to get your values in. If it's too thick, it's going to make it very hard to control where your paint goes. So there's a balance. Once you have water over the entire petal, I'm going to get a little bit of the alizarin crimson, and I'm going to stay kind of in the middle of my flower, and I'm not worried about blends right now. I just want to get some color down. And then just to the lower half of this particular petal, I'm going to add some purple lake. Now notice how I'm not bringing my color all the way down to the very bottom of this flower petal. I want there to be some room down there, so I'm leaving just clean water. If you find that your paint is starting to puddle and travel into areas where you don't want it, rinse your brush, dry it on your sponge, and use that brush to kind of push back on some of those colors. I'm now going to use a brush that I've rinsed, and it is just mildly damp. And I'm going to use this damp brush to kind of pull some of these colors up into the upper half of this petal, creating some softer values. And this is going to give the illusion of the petal being transparent. So I just want to get a little tint of this color throughout that upper half of the petal. And I'm taking a moment while things are still wet to push my color right up to the edge of the flower. Now, before things dry, I want to push my values a bit and go a little darker. So I'm going to set this brush aside, and I'm going to get a smaller brush, make sure it's wet, and I'm now going to grab some of that alizarin crimson, and I tapped my brush on the sponge just to remove some of the color so it wasn't too loaded with paint. So it's a very semi-loaded brush. And I'm just dragging my brush from the outer edge on the top half down to the bottom half. And I do it in one stroke. I'm making sure I pick my brush off only when I come down to the bottom, because I know from experience, the brush is going to want to release a little bit of pigment when it's picked up, leaving like a little blob. So I make a point to try not to pick my brush up until I'm down below where the values are darker. Now I still have a nice glossy appearance on this lower half, so I can continue to push the values a little further on this flower. So to get a darker color, I'm going to take some purple lake, but I'm going to add some of that darker ultramarine blue so it goes to more of a grape purple. So more of a cool purple. And I'm going to try and kind of create this shadow before things dry. And remember, if your paper is drying too fast, use that fine mister from a distance and just give yourself a small mist. The only downside to using a mister is you might create a fuzzy outside edge to your petal just because of the water going everywhere and not being localized to one petal. As I get down towards the bottom, I don't want to keep pushing paint near the stem. So I'm going to rinse the paint out of my brush. I'm going to tap my sponge, and with just a barely damp brush, I'm going to just kind of smooth things out on the bottom here and do my best to maintain a really nice light value. I'm double checking my edges, making sure I went right up to the edges with my paint, but I'm already losing that gloss on the upper half of my petal, so I really need to just kind of stay out of there or I'm going to create blooms and textures. So while that petal is drying, I'm going to hop over to this far right petal that is kind of only showing a thin sliver. I'm using my small number 2 round just because I'm working in a small narrow space. And I'm going to apply water first. I know it looks like I'm applying paint just because this water is a little dirty. But I'm doing my best to not hit the background or this center petal with my water. When I get to really narrow space, I try to hold my brush more vertical, pointed towards the ceiling, and I keep my pressure very, very gentle and light, and that ensures that I am able to get into thin, narrow spaces. Once you have water throughout that petal, make sure there's no standing thick puddles of water, and then you can bring your paint color over. I'm going to start with the alizarin crimson towards the top portion of this petal, and I'm going to take a moment to just take my time and really try to get this color right up to the edge. I want to have just a small amount of purple in this color, so I have color harmony. I find it very hard to paint without rotating my paper, but for the sake of the video, I'm not rotating. But if you're at home, I encourage you to rotate your paper to make it easier for you. Now, as I near the bottom half of this petal, I am using just a damp brush to kind of pull from the color I applied towards the top. Because I want a lighter value towards the bottom. Taking my time to really have clean edges. Now I can't paint any other petals until these two dry because they are sharing an edge. If I do, I'm going to lose the defined edge between each petal. So I'm going to let this dry and come back to it. Now that everything is dry, I'm going to take a moment to clean up some of my edges. To do that, I am using a relatively stiff brush. A square brush would be best. I'm going to put clean water on it so it's wet, but I'm going to rub my fingers across the metal ferrule just to remove any droplets of water so I don't get anything unexpected. Now with this wet brush, if my paint went to the outside of my petal where I didn't want it, I'm just going to use this wet brush with gentle pressure to lift and clean up the edge. And I'm not being heavy-handed. Now, the fact that I am working on quality paper lends itself to kind of fixing mistakes like this without the paper surface tearing. If you are working on less expensive paper, you might find that this technique can't really be used often on those papers because it might make the top surface of your paper begin to tear. So make sure you're working on quality paper, and that's going to give you a much better experience. So I've cleaned up that edge quite a bit. I'm now going to clean up the edge on the right side. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to make that a little bit more subtle. Now, because of that lifting, I now have two areas on my flower that are damp. I need to let them dry before I move on. Now that everything's dry, I'm going to work on the petal that is in the center. I'm going to do wet into wet again. So I need to apply clean water throughout this petal. And again, I have to be very heavy-handed with this first initial application of water. I'm doing my best to leave just the tiniest bit of space between my water and the nearby petals, just to ensure I don't accidentally extend into those areas. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. The area where I started applying the water has already begun to dry, so I need to go in there and apply a second layer. Once you feel like everything is staying nice and glossy and it's not drying on you, you can then dry your brush on a nearby paper towel or sponge and just tap the top surface of any puddles to soak them up. Once the puddles are removed, you can begin adding your paint color. I'm going to use a smaller round brush for this. This is just a number 6. And I'm going to begin with the darker purple on the upper left-hand edge. Now this purple did kind of this funky little spread the moment I touched it to the paper. And that's because I accidentally left some dish soap in the brush. And that's just some of the characteristics of what dish soap does. So I rinsed my brush out good, and I'm coming back in here with that same grape purple. Now, in order to ensure I have good contrast, I need to really make sure the value I'm using in this area of this petal is nice and dark in comparison to the surrounding areas. So I feel like the values are a little too close for comfort between this purple and the background colors nearby. So I'm going to add just a small amount of Payne's Gray, which is kind of like this real dark blue-black. And right along this top edge, to ensure I have good contrast between the areas, I'm going to add some of this color to the purple. I'm going to rinse the Payne's Gray out of my brush. And I'm going to continue pulling this color down into the rest of the petal. So I'm still working with that grape purple that I made using the Purple Lake and the ultramarine blue. As I get down towards the bottom half of my petal, I want there to be a little more transparency. So I'm rinsing all the paint out of my brush, and I'm using a fairly dry, clean brush to pick up some of the paint color to lighten it so it doesn't get too dark. Once my brush doesn't want to pick up any additional color, I dry it on a sponge or paper towel to give myself some absorbency again. Once that left portion of the petal has some color on it, I can begin adding more color to the right side. So I'm going to get a little bit of the alizarin crimson. I'm going to stay kind of centered on this petal where the crease is. I'm pulling that color down in one stroke where the natural crease would be on this petal. Trying to take my time to get nice clean edges on the top. I'm now rinsing all the paint out of my brush, and with a clean, barely damp brush, I'm just coming in and pulling some of that color down to create some of the values I want. Now there's a large shadow on the right side of this petal, but this shadow has very distinct sharp edges to it. So I have to do that on the second layer. So I'm not going to worry about the shadow color just yet. Right now, I just want to kind of get some transparency to the colors I'm using. There's also a shadow at the very bottom of this petal near the stem, But again, that's another shadow that has very visible and clear edges. So I can't apply those dark values on a wet surface and get that definition. So I need to wait until this layer dries before establishing my shadows using a glaze. I'm making sure there is minimal color at the very base of the flower. And I'm now going to let this petal dry before the next layer. I'm going to use my small number 2 brush to paint these 2 petals on the left and right side. These are such small shapes, I don't feel the need to apply water first. So I'm just taking some Purple Lake into this rear petal here. And I want to make sure I have a difference in value so that it kind of stands out. Right now, I feel like it's very similar in value. So I'm going to add just a small amount of Payne's Gray, and I'm going to mix it in with this purple right on the paper surface. Now I'm going to rinse the paint out of my brush, and this time I'm going to come over to this left side, and I'm going to apply just a thin amount of clean water. Doesn't have to be perfect, but this will just give me some working time. And I'm trying to not rest my hand into the area I just painted. Now I'm going to grab a small amount of the Purple Lake. And I'm going to have just a lighter value on this left and upper edge. But towards the bottom, again, I want good contrast, so I need to add a darker value. So I'm going to use some of that Great Purple. And I'm just going to use a clean, damp brush while things are still drying. I'm just going to kind of create some of the blends that I want in here. Add a little bit of Payne's Gray and mix on your surface if you still have the working time. And that's going to help give you that contrast you need. My petal there is already beginning to dry, so I have to be hands off. Any additional details I'll just have to accomplish on the next pass. While those 2 areas are drying, I'm going to work on my shadows here, and I'm going to do that using a glaze. So I want to make sure I have the right color mixed up. I'm going to have some Purple Lake. I'm going to add some of the alizarin crimson. And lastly, I'm going to even add some of that Payne's Gray. I'm using a scrap piece of paper to just test out my color. And I think that's plenty dark enough. I don't need it to be much darker than that. Now this is a relatively large shadow, so I'm going to apply a thin amount of clean water first. So I want to imagine this shadow is going to come down from the edge of this right side petal, and it's going to come down at a diagonal about midway before it jolts back towards the outer side of my petal. So to create that shape, I'm going to apply some clean water using feather light pressure. And I want it to kind of come in and meet up with this opposite side before it kicks back. I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see where I applied that clean water. Now I'm going to take the color I mixed for this shadow and I may have to switch to my small brush to give myself better visibility. But I want this shadow to meet up right with the edge of that petal on the right. And we can have kind of this little irregular edge to it, so it looks like a more natural petal shape. I'm going to bring this shadow color all the way to the right side of that center petal. And I feel like this color may not be as dark as I need it to be, so I'm going to add some Payne's Gray, and I'm going to mix the two on the surface of my paper. And I know this is going to lighten up when it dries, so I don't have to panic when it initially looks really dark. You just have to kind of trust in the process. As I get to the bottom here, I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to use a lightly damp brush to pull the remainder of this shadow color down towards the stem, but I'm going to stop before the stem so I can still maintain that little bit of white that is down there. And I'm going to let that shadow dry. Now there's also a shadow that cuts across here, but I can't paint it yet until this first shadow dries since they're sharing an edge. So I'm going to hop back up to the top left, verify that the petal I painted previously is completely dry. And I'm just going to take a small amount of clean water into this back section here of the petal. I'm going to get a little bit of the alizarin crimson on my brush, and just towards the left edge, I'm going to add a little bit of this color. And then I'm going to rinse my brush, and with a clean damp brush, I want to blend this color out into the water. And I'm taking my time on my edges so I have a nice neat product before it dries. While these two areas are drying, I'm going to take a moment to paint the stem. I'm going to take my number 6 round, rinse it off, and I'm going to apply some clean water in the stem area. I'm not going to stress about going right up to the left and right edge. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now that my stem is wet, I am going to grab the darkest green I mixed up, which is the sap and ultramarine blue. And I'm going to fill the stem with this color. Sometimes tapping my brush helps release the pigment a little easier. And while that pigment is still wet, I'm going to use my small number 2 round just to push that color right up to that left edge. Notice how I did not square off the top edge of the flower. I gave it some curve so it looks like those petals are kind of coming out from the stem. So I'm kind of following that contour. While this stem is very wet, I'm going to get some of that Payne's gray and I'm going to add a shadow on the left edge of this stem so it doesn't camouflage in to my background and it has a nice light source. I'm not worried about this Payne's gray being perfect. I like their irregular edges. I think it adds some interest, so I'm not worried about smoothing all of that out. Now I need to give this stem time to dry before we finalize the last couple shadows we have. Now that the stem and shadows that we had started are completely dry, I can proceed with the shadows that are down in the center here. So I'm going to first start with a little bit of water. And I'm not going to bring that water all the way down to the stem. Now I want to make sure there's no big thick puddles of water. So I'm taking a moment to remove a little bit of puddling. And I'm now going to go to that cerulean blue. And I'm going to create a curve at the bottom of this petal. And I tried to keep it relatively centered between the two edges that are visible. Now I'm going to grab some of the shadow color that I used on the right side here. And I'm going to apply a glaze. Now this shadow has a unique shape to it. So I'm trying to be very mindful of that shape. And I'm moving slowly so that I can give myself time to kind of interpret what my eyes are seeing in the reference photo. Once I am happy with my shadow shape, if I feel like it needs to be just a smidge darker in a couple areas, I can add some of that Payne's gray to darken up parts, if not all, of the shadow. Now, while everything is still wet, I'm going to rinse my brush, remove the excess water from my brush by tapping it on my sponge. And I'm now going to drag the bottom edge of my blue down towards the stem. Now I need to let that particular shadow dry. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to begin adding some additional details to other areas of my flower. One is I want to add a more defining edge to the shadow on this left petal. Now, in order to do that, I need to do a very gentle glaze. I don't want to accidentally lift or gouge this previous layer that is already dry. So I'm going to use my number 8 round brush. I'm going to be feather light with my pressure, sometimes tapping the brush is a little better than dragging it, especially when you're doing a glaze on top of a layer that's relatively dark. Now, while this is wet, I'm going to take my shadow color that I mixed up for the glazes. And I'm just going on the top edge to create a more defined shadow edge. And because I put that water there previously, that water is going to help blend my shadow with the rest of the petal. If I feel like that's still not dark enough, we can always add some of that Payne's gray to parts of our shadow while it's still wet. The shadow down below should already be dry. If it's not, just be very mindful of it so you don't come in contact. And I'm just using some clean water to pull the bottom edge of this glazed shadow so I can blend it more. And keep in mind, this technique takes practice. I've been painting for a really long time, so try not to compare. Just be patient with yourself as you try these new skills and techniques. While that shadow is drying, I'm going to hop over to the bottom right to establish a shadow there. This is going to be a mixture of the purple with Payne's gray. And this is such a small, narrow shadow. I'm not going to apply water previously. So I'm just going to come in here, create the shape that I see. Before things dry, I'm going to use a clean, damp brush just to make sure that shadow color gets right to the right edge. And I can kind of soften that bottom edge down towards the stem. If you feel like you didn't quite get the color you were looking for while things are still damp, just fill the entire shadow space with color again. You just have to coat the entire shadow to avoid the weird brush strokes and textures. My brush just dropped a lot of water into this small space, so I have to dry my brush to soak up the puddling. And now all we have to do is add a couple defining edges to just the texture of our petal. So I'm going to use a stiff square brush. This one has a little bit of an angle to it. You can just have a regular square. It'll make things simpler. I'm going to get it wet with clean water, and I'm going to get a paper towel handy that is dry and clean. And what I'm going to do is my goal is to lift a thin, narrow line just for the top 1/3 of this petal. And I'm going to use a wet brush with barely any pressure. And notice how little the bristles of my brush are bending. That tells you how gentle and light-handed I am being. This isn't a technique I do with muscle. I'm being very, very gentle, feather light, and I'm just trying to create that crease that is pretty typical in tulip petals that goes down the center. And I feel like I like that, so I don't even need the paper towel. But I'm going to use that same technique, wet brush. I removed the water from the metal ferrule. And I can now create some creases going in a diagonal out towards the outer edge of this tulip. And I don't need a lot, just a couple. I can do the same thing on this left edge. Now, if after lifting out some of this petal texture, you feel like it's a little too bright, you can always come in here with a really watered down paint color and tint these areas so it doesn't look as bright. It's really just up to you. I'm just taking a moment to pause and ask myself if I really need anything else. I like the idea of brightening this edge here, but I will need to tilt my paper. Sorry about that. So I can get in there at the right angle because of the way my hand moves. So I'm just coming in and lifting a little bit of that edge to brighten it up. Things down here in this center shadow have already dried. So I can continue with this crease, but I want to come up from the bottom this time. And I don't have to connect the two. I just want to angle them towards each other so they're on the same line. And that's our tulip. I hope you learned a lot from this watercolor tutorial. I would love to see any photos you have. And please leave a comment. Let me know what flowers you are interested in learning how to paint. Maybe you will be my next tutorial. Have a fantastic day. Don't forget to like and subscribe.